Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And the beauty of the poetry that Jesus uses here is evident as now this final grouping, this final blessing, are gifted the kingdom of heaven. The same thing that the poor in spirit were gifted in the very first beatitude. It's like this inclusio that brings us all the way around back to where we began. That the kingdom of God is gifted to all of us, that God comes to all of us, that the divine meets all of us and reminds us of how loved we are. And then that same kingdom begins to transform, it begins to inspire, it begins to change us into righteous actors in the world. This is the power of grace, that grace is what saves us and grace is what sanctifies, changes, transforms us in the world. But when we look at this one, there's something really important here. We are told that blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness. And there's two things we have to be aware of here. First, they are not blessed because they are persecuted for their righteousness. Jesus does not personalize it here. That's not what turns people against them. No, he is talking here about rightness. And we have to understand that Jesus is informed by the Jewish story. And in the Jewish imagination, in the Jewish culture, the ideas of righteousness and justice were not separable. So the word in Greek is dikaiosune, but it corresponds to the Hebrew idea tzadek. And tzaddik was this idea that meant righteousness. But in the Jewish culture, there was not a separate word for your internal personal rightness with God and your external corporate rightness in the world. Both of those were tzaddik, both of those were righteousness. And when Jesus says, blessed are those who are persecuted because of rightness, righteousness, and he doesn't personalize it to your righteousness, what he's talking about here is our rightness corporately together in the world. And in English, this is what we call justice. This is those of us who work for what is right in the world. We work for justice in the world. And when we work for that, it will upset the status quo, and that will threaten some people. When we work for a righteousness in the world, not our righteousness, but a justice among us, that will offend, it will upset, it will overturn the balance of the status quo that works for many people. And this is exactly what happens in Jesus' story. The oppressed and the marginalized, they are immediately drawn to the significance of Jesus' message, this kingdom of God that has come to them in their poverty. But those who are powerful, those whom the status quo works for, the wealthy, the powerful politically, the powerful religiously, all of those people, well, they are threatened by Jesus. And they then begin to persecute Jesus because Jesus is challenging this status quo. This is what Jesus ends with here. In all the ways that we begin to see the kingdom of God, that we begin to understand the kingdom of God, in all the ways that God's imagination for the world comes to us and reinvents us and reimagines us from the inside out, well, then we are going to begin to call for that rightness, that right way of being in the world. And that is going to threaten those for whom the world works. When we are persecuted for that, when we are persecuted for standing up for those who are marginalized, voiceless, and powerless, this is when we are blessed, because this is when we come into alignment with everything that God imagines for the world. You are not blessed when you are persecuted for your righteousness because you hold your religion up in front of people and you annoy them or bash them over the head with it. You are blessed when you align your imagination of the world with God's and you begin to work for those who do not have what you take for granted. You are persecuted when you work for righteousness, when you work for justice. And when you do that, you will find yourself in alignment with this kingdom of God, this kingdom of heaven that comes to all of us equally, just as it did in the first beatitude.